The massive crystalline spires of the Terran royal palace gleamed under the twin suns of New Earth, their surfaces reflecting the approaching diplomatic convoy in brilliant cascades of light. Ambassador Chen Wei adjusted her formal uniform one final time, watching through the transparent aluminum windows as the German Federation's flagship descended through the atmosphere with all the grace of a falling mountain. "Nervous?" asked Captain Rodriguez, her aide-de-camp, nodding the way her fingers drummed against the polished railing. "Terrified?" Chen admitted without shame. "The last time humans hosted a Galactic Council member for a state visit, we accidentally started 3 trade wars and nearly caused a diplomatic incident that would have resulted in our expulsion from civilized space." Rodriguez chuckled. "That was different. The Zephyrian ambassador wasn't expecting our enthusiastic hospitality. Plus, nobody warned us that their species considers loud music a form of psychological warfare." Chen watched as the German president's vessel settled onto the designated landing platform with mechanical precision. President Klaus Weber had been chosen specifically for this visit because of his reputation for diplomatic excellence and his ability to navigate complex political situations. What made this particular state occasion momentous wasn't just that it represented the first formal diplomatic exchange between Earth's scattered colonies and the German Federation of Worlds, but that it was being hosted by the newly established Terran royal family. The concept of royalty had seemed absurd to most humans when the Galactic Council had suggested it 3 years ago. Democracy was humanity's greatest export, they had argued. The idea of bowing to kings and queens went against everything their species stood for. But the Council had been patient in their explanation. Every successful member species had some form of hereditary leadership structure that provided stability across generations. It wasn't about power or privilege, they insisted, but about creating institutional memory that lasted beyond electoral cycles. The compromise had been elegant in its simplicity. The royal family would serve purely ceremonial functions, hosting diplomatic events and representing humanity's cultural heritage to the galaxy. They would have no real political power, but would provide the kind of traditional authority structure that other species found comfortable and familiar. Queen Sarah had been chosen from among Earth's most accomplished diplomats. A woman whose career spanning 4 decades had seen her negotiate everything from mining rights in the asteroid belt to peace treaties between warring colonies. King James was a cultural historian whose expertise in human traditions made him the perfect complement to her political acumen. Together, they had spent the last 3 years learning the intricate protocols of galactic diplomacy, while raising their twin children in the strange new reality of ceremonial royalty. "The German delegation is requesting permission to approach," came the voice through the communication system. "Granted," Chen responded, then activated the palace-wide announcement system. "All staff, prepare for ceremonial reception. Remember, this isn't just about impressing our guests. Every species in the council will be watching how we handle this. We need to prove that humans can master the art of formal diplomacy without losing what makes us human." The massive doors of the palace's main reception hall swung open with a soft whisper of hydraulics, revealing a space that had taken the best human architects 3 years to design. The challenge had been enormous. Create something that honored human aesthetic traditions while meeting the expectations of species whose ideas of beauty and grandeur spanned everything from towering crystal formations to intricate mathematical patterns carved into living metal. The result was breathtaking. Soaring ceilings disappeared into shadows far above, supported by columns that seemed to grow from the floor like enormous trees. Each column was carved with scenes from human history, but not the usual collection of wars and conquests. Instead, they depicted moments of human creativity and cooperation. Scientists working together in laboratories, artists collaborating on masterpieces, explorers helping each other survive in impossible conditions. The floor was a masterpiece of inlaid wood and stone, creating patterns that told the story of humanity's journey to the stars. At the center, directly beneath a skylight that bathed the space in natural illumination, sat the throne of Earth. It wasn't the massive, intimidating seat of power that many species preferred, but something that spoke to human values. Crafted from wood taken from every continent on Earth, its design emphasized accessibility and approachability rather than dominance. Queen Sarah emerged from the private chambers, and Chen felt a surge of pride at how perfectly she embodied everything they had hoped to achieve. Her gown was a work of art that managed to be both recognizably human and utterly alien, woven from fibers that shifted color subtly as she moved, creating patterns that seemed to tell stories with each step. The crown on her head was simple but elegant, incorporating elements from every human culture. Carved jade from China, worked gold from Africa, intricate silver from Northern Europe, polished obsidian from the Americas. King James appeared beside her, his formal robes somehow managing to look both ancient and futuristic. Where the Queen's outfit emphasized flow and movement, his spoke of stability and strength, dark fabrics shot through with threads that caught the light like captured starshine. The royal children, Prince Michael and Princess Elizabeth, took their places beside their parents. At 16, they were old enough to understand the significance of what was happening, but young enough that their natural curiosity and enthusiasm hadn't been completely buried under the weight of protocol. They would serve as guides for President Weber's own children, a diplomatic gesture that spoke to the human emphasis on family and continuity. "The German delegation has entered the palace," Rodriguez announced quietly. Through the massive windows that lined the reception hall, Chen could see the approaching procession. President Weber led the way, his own formal attire a masterpiece of German engineering and aesthetic design. Behind him came his wife, Anna, and their teenage son, Friedrich. The rest of the delegation included the German foreign minister, several cultural attachés, and a small security detail that moved with the precise efficiency that German military training was famous for throughout human space. What made this moment truly historic wasn't just the meeting between Earth's new royalty and one of humanity's most successful colonial governments. It was what it represented, the maturation of human civilization into something that could stand as equals among species that had been practicing galactic diplomacy for millennia. The doors to the reception hall opened, and President Weber stepped inside. For a moment, the two groups simply looked at each other across the vast space, representatives of humanity's past and future meeting in a moment that would define their species' place in the galaxy. Queen Sarah stepped forward, her voice carrying easily through the hall despite its enormous size. "President Weber, on behalf of the people of Earth and all human colonies, we welcome you to the Terran Royal Palace. Your presence here honors not just our new traditions, but the enduring bonds that connect all of humanity among the stars." Weber's response was equally formal, but Chen could hear the warmth beneath the diplomatic language. "Your Majesty, it is my honor to stand here as representative of the German Federation of Worlds. We come not as strangers, but as family, separated by the vastness of space, but united by our shared heritage and common hopes for the future." The formal greetings continued, each word carefully chosen and rehearsed, but Chen found herself watching the faces of the participants rather than listening to the words. She could see the genuine emotion behind the ceremonial language, the recognition that this moment represented something unprecedented in human history. For the first time since leaving Earth, humanity was presenting itself to the galaxy not as a collection of scattered colonies and competing governments, but as a unified civilization with its own unique traditions and values. The royal family represented something that had never existed before, a symbol of human unity that transcended political boundaries and national loyalties. As the formal reception continued, Chen allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism. Perhaps they could actually pull this off. Perhaps humanity really could learn to navigate the complex world of galactic politics without losing the qualities that made them unique among the stars. The first test would come soon enough. Tomorrow, the real negotiations would begin, and the entire galaxy would be watching to see whether Earth's new royal family could successfully mediate between the competing interests of humanity's scattered worlds. The stakes couldn't be higher, but for the first time in years, Chen found herself believing that they might actually succeed. The ceremonial reception was just the beginning. The real work was about to start, and everything humanity had achieved in the galaxy might depend on how well they had learned the ancient art of royal diplomacy. The state dining hall of the Terran Royal Palace had been designed to accommodate the wildly different dietary and social requirements of a dozen different species. But tonight, it hosted only humans. The irony wasn't lost on Ambassador Chen as she watched President Weber and his delegation take their seats at the massive table that had been crafted from a single piece of Martian redwood. Queen Sarah had insisted on keeping the dinner traditional, despite the advice of several protocol experts who had suggested incorporating alien customs to demonstrate humanity's cosmopolitan nature. "We're not trying to impress them with how much we've changed," she had explained during the planning sessions. "We're showing them who we are." The meal itself was a masterpiece of human culinary tradition. The chefs had worked for months to create a menu that represented the best of Earth's diverse food cultures while remaining recognizably human. German sauerbraten sat alongside Italian osso buco, Japanese sushi shared space with Mexican mole, and the wines came from vineyards on 6 different worlds that had been carefully tended by families who had carried Earth's agricultural traditions to the stars. President Weber raised his glass, the crystal catching the warm light from the chandeliers that hung like captured constellations above their heads. "To Queen Sarah and King James, who have taken on the enormous responsibility of representing all of humanity to the galaxy, and to the hope that our children will inherit a universe where human values of freedom, dignity, and cooperation light the way for all species." The toast was echoed around the table, but Chen noticed that the real conversations were happening in the spaces between the formal words. Prince Michael was deep in discussion with Friedrich Weber about their shared interest in xenoarchaeology, while Princess Elizabeth was explaining to the German foreign minister why she believed humanity's greatest strength lay in its ability to adapt rather than its technological achievements. King James leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful as he listened to President Weber describe the challenges of governing a federation that spanned 12 star systems. "The distance makes everything more complicated," Weber was saying. "By the time a message reaches our furthest colonies, the crisis it was meant to address has either resolved itself or evolved into something completely different." "That's exactly why the Council insisted we needed this kind of institutional continuity," Queen Sarah replied. "Democratic governments change with each election cycle. Royal traditions provide stability that spans generations, not power but perspective." Chen found herself drawn into the conversation despite her intention to simply observe. The Altarian Republic tried to solve the same problem with their Council of Elders, but they discovered that elected wisdom doesn't carry the same weight as inherited responsibility. There's something about knowing that your decisions will affect your children's ability to serve that changes how you approach problems. "Exactly," said Anna Weber, President Weber's wife. "Klaus agonizes over every decision because he knows he'll have to face the voters again in 4 years. But that also means he sometimes makes choices based on short-term political considerations rather than long-term consequences." President Weber smiled ruefully. "It's true. Democracy is humanity's greatest gift to the galaxy, but it's not perfect. We've had to learn to balance the will of the people with the need for consistent policy over decades rather than electoral cycles." The conversation was interrupted by the soft chime that indicated an urgent message had arrived through the palace's communication system. Ambassador Chen excused herself and stepped into an alcove where she could receive the transmission privately. The holographic display showed the face of Admiral Thompson, commander of the Terran Defense Fleet. His expression was grim enough to send ice through Chen's veins. "Ambassador, we have a situation developing in the Centauri system. The Draknari hegemony has dispatched a fleet to what they claim are disputed territories that happen to include 3 human colonies." Chen's mind raced through the implications. The Draknari were one of the most aggressive species in the Galactic Council, notorious for their belief that military strength was the only true measure of a civilization's worth. They had been testing humanity's resolve for years, probing for weaknesses and waiting for an opportunity to demonstrate that the newest council members were unworthy of their status. "How long do we have?" Chen asked. "Their fleet will reach the outer colonies in approximately 72 hours. The German Federation has significant interests in that sector, including 2 major industrial complexes and a research station studying xenobiology." The timing couldn't have been worse. With President Weber on Earth for the state visit, the German Federation's military response would be delayed by at least a day while communications traveled back to their capital world. And any human military action would be seen as either abandoning the diplomatic process in favor of force, or as evidence that humanity still couldn't resolve conflicts without resorting to violence. Chen made a decision that would either save the situation or destroy everything they had worked to build. "Admiral, I'm going to need you to trust me on this. Do not take any military action yet. Give me 6 hours to work through diplomatic channels. Thompson's expression suggested he thought she had lost her mind, but he nodded. 6 hours, Ambassador. After that, I'm moving to protect those colonies with or without authorization. Chen returned to the dining hall, her mind already working through possibilities. As she took her seat, she noticed that several of the other guests were also receiving urgent communications. The situation was developing faster than she had hoped. President Weber noticed her expression immediately. Problems, Ambassador. The traditional response would have been to handle the crisis through normal diplomatic channels, keeping the German delegation insulated from what was essentially a Terran military matter. But Chen found herself looking at Queen Sarah, remembering her words about showing who they really were rather than trying to impress with how much they had changed. President Weber, I'm afraid we may need to cut dinner short. The Draknari are moving against human colonies in Centauri, including German Federation assets. Under normal circumstances, this would be handled through separate diplomatic channels, but the timing creates certain complications. Weber's face darkened, but it was King James who spoke first. Ambassador, what do you need from us? The question caught Chen off guard. In traditional galactic diplomacy, ceremonial rulers stayed carefully neutral in political matters. But King James was asking not as a powerless figurehead, but as someone who understood that leadership sometimes meant taking responsibility even when you didn't have authority. Your Majesty, the Draknari respect strength, but they also understand tradition and hierarchy. If the response to their aggression comes from Earth's royal family rather than from military commanders or elected officials, it carries different implications. It suggests that humanity sees this not as a military matter, but as a question of honor and civilized behavior. Queen Sarah was already rising from her chair. Then, we respond accordingly. President Weber, would the German Federation be willing to join us in a formal diplomatic protest delivered through the royal court rather than through normal governmental channels? Weber's smile was predatory. Your Majesty, it would be my honor. The Draknari believe that humans are too chaotic to present a united front. Perhaps it's time we proved them wrong. Within minutes, the elegant state dinner had transformed into an impromptu war council. Maps of the Centauri system appeared on the dining room's display screens, while translation algorithms worked to craft a response that would carry maximum impact in the Draknari language. Princess Elizabeth, who had been quietly listening to the adult conversations all evening, suddenly spoke up. What if we invited them to send a representative to Earth, not for negotiations, but to witness human traditions firsthand? The Draknari respect strength, but they've never seen our kind of strength. Chen stared at the 16-year-old princess, realizing that she had just proposed something that could completely change the dynamic of the crisis. Instead of responding to Draknari aggression with matching force, they would be demonstrating confidence by inviting their enemies to observe human civilization at its most formal and traditional. That's brilliant, breathed President Weber. We're not backing down from the confrontation, but we're forcing them to engage with us on our terms rather than theirs. King James was already activating the palace's communication systems. Admiral Thompson, this is King James. Please prepare to transmit a formal invitation to the Draknari fleet commander. They are invited to send a representative to witness the conclusion of the German state visit and to observe human diplomatic traditions before taking any action against human colonies. The response came back within minutes, and Chen could hear the confusion in Admiral Thompson's voice. Your Majesty, the Draknari fleet has stopped. They're requesting clarification of the invitation and asking for details about human diplomatic protocols. Queen Sarah smiled, and for the first time since the crisis began, Chen allowed herself to hope. Admiral, please inform them that Prince Michael and Princess Elizabeth will personally guide their representative through the palace and explain human traditions. And Admiral, make sure they understand that attacking human colonies while our guests are present would be considered a grave violation of hospitality laws that are recognized throughout civilized space. The transformation was immediate. Instead of a potential military crisis that could have resulted in thousands of casualties and a permanent breakdown in human-Draknari relations, they had created a diplomatic opportunity that could establish new precedents for how conflicts were resolved in council space. President Weber raised his glass again, but this time his smile was genuine rather than formal. To the royal family of Earth, who have just demonstrated why humanity deserves its place among the stars, and to our children, who see solutions that we adults miss because we're too busy preparing for the fights we expect instead of the opportunities we create. Chen realized that she was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history, a potential military conflict being resolved not through superior firepower or economic pressure, but through the simple human conviction that even enemies could be transformed into guests if you offered them the right kind of hospitality. The real test would come tomorrow, when the Draknari representative arrived and discovered whether human diplomatic traditions were strong enough to contain the ambitions of one of the galaxy's most aggressive species. The Draknari shuttle descended through Earth's atmosphere like a falling blade, its dark hull absorbing light rather than reflecting it, creating an ominous silhouette against the morning sky. Ambassador Chen watched its approach from the palace's observation deck, acutely aware that everything humanity had achieved in galactic politics might depend on the next few hours. "Are we insane?" Captain Rodriguez asked, voicing the question that had been haunting Chen since dawn. "We just invited one of the most militaristic species in the galaxy to observe our most important diplomatic ceremonies. If this goes wrong, we won't just lose face. We could lose everything." Chen adjusted the formal diplomatic sash across her uniform, noting how the weight of it seemed heavier today than it had during yesterday's reception for President Weber. "Possibly, but consider the alternative. If we had responded to the Draknari fleet with military force, we would have proved their point about human aggression. If we had backed down, we would have demonstrated weakness. This is the only option that lets us control the narrative." Through the palace's communication system came the announcement they had been waiting for. Draknari shuttle requesting final approach clearance. Ambassador Vexai aboard, along with a cultural observation team. Queen Sarah's voice responded immediately, her tone carrying the perfect balance of authority and hospitality that she had spent 3 years perfecting. "Clearance granted. Ambassador Vexai, you are welcome to Earth and to the Terran Royal Palace. We look forward to sharing our traditions with representatives of the Draknari hegemony." The response came in heavily accented but perfectly correct Standard Galactic. "Queen Sarah of Earth, the hegemony acknowledges your hospitality. We come to observe and understand human diplomatic customs before proceeding with our planned activities in Centauri space." Chen felt her stomach clench at the carefully chosen words. The Draknari were making it clear that they still considered military action against the human colonies to be an option, depending on what they observed during their visit. This wasn't a diplomatic solution. It was a test with potentially devastating consequences for failure. Prince Michael and Princess Elizabeth appeared beside Chen, both dressed in formal court attire that managed to look both ancient and futuristic. At 16, they were still young enough to be nervous about meeting representatives of a species famous for considering physical combat the highest form of communication, but old enough to understand the stakes. "Remember," Chen told them quietly, "the Draknari respect strength, but they define strength differently than we do. For them, it's about individual dominance and the ability to impose your will on others. We need to show them that human strength comes from our ability to cooperate and create something greater than the sum of our parts." Princess Elizabeth nodded, but her next question revealed the sharp intelligence that had impressed every diplomat who had worked with her. "Ambassador, what if they're not capable of understanding that kind of strength? What if they can only see cooperation as weakness?" "Then we'll have learned something important about the limits of diplomacy," Chen replied. "But I don't think that's the case. The fact that they accepted our invitation instead of simply attacking suggests that they're curious about human methods. Curiosity is something we can work with." The massive doors of the reception hall opened once again, but this time the atmosphere was entirely different from yesterday's carefully orchestrated welcome for President Weber. The German president and his delegation stood to one side, formal observers of an unprecedented moment in galactic diplomacy. The Draknari party that entered couldn't have presented a greater contrast to their human hosts. Ambassador Vexai stood nearly 8 feet tall, his scaled hide bearing the ritual scars that indicated high military rank within the hegemony. His companions were slightly smaller but equally imposing, their formal diplomatic attire consisting of what appeared to be armor that had been polished to mirror brightness. Every movement they made spoke of contained violence and the constant readiness for combat that defined Draknari culture. Queen Sarah stepped forward with the same grace she had shown President Weber. But Chen noticed subtle differences in her posture and tone that indicated careful adaptation to her new guests. Where yesterday's reception had emphasized warmth and familial connection, today's greeting stressed dignity and mutual respect between equals. Ambassador Vexai, on behalf of humanity and the Terran royal family, I welcome you to Earth. We hope that your observation of our diplomatic traditions will provide insight into the methods by which humans resolve conflicts and maintain cooperation across the vastness of space. Vexai's response rumbled through the hall like distant thunder. Queen of humans, the hegemony acknowledges your invitation. We have come to understand why your species believes that words can accomplish what strength achieves more efficiently. Show us these traditions you claim can resolve the matter of Centauri space. The challenge was explicit and unmistakable. The Draknari weren't here to participate in diplomatic pleasantries. They were here to evaluate whether human methods were worthy of respect or deserving of contempt. Chen felt the weight of centuries of human progress pressing down on her shoulders. King James stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of quiet authority that came from absolute confidence in his position. Ambassador Vexai, human diplomatic tradition rests on a simple principle, that the strongest solutions are those that all parties can accept voluntarily rather than those imposed by force. We invite you to observe how this principle works in practice. What followed was unlike anything that had ever been attempted in galactic diplomacy. Instead of formal negotiations conducted in private chambers, the humans began demonstrating their decision-making processes in full view of their Draknari guests. President Weber and Queen Sarah sat down at a table that had been prepared in the center of the reception hall, with representatives of the affected human colonies participating via holographic projection. The situation is straightforward, Queen Sarah began. The Draknari hegemony claims that human colonies in Centauri space have expanded beyond their authorized boundaries. Some of these colonies include significant German Federation assets. We must determine the truth of these claims and find a solution that protects human interests while respecting legitimate Draknari concerns. Ambassador Vexai interrupted immediately. The solution is obvious. The humans withdraw to their authorized territories. The hegemony occupies the disputed space. Strength determines outcome. Prince Michael rose from his seat, and Chen held her breath as the 16-year-old prince addressed one of the galaxy's most dangerous warriors. Ambassador Vexai, may I ask a question about Draknari traditions? In your culture, when two warriors of equal strength claim the same territory, how is the dispute resolved? Vexai's eyes narrowed, recognizing a potential trap but curious enough to respond. Combat determines worthiness. The stronger claim prevails. And if the combat results in both warriors being too injured to claim the territory, what happens then? There was a long pause before Vexai answered. The territory remains unclaimed. Both warriors have proven their strength but lost the ability to benefit from it. Princess Elizabeth stood beside her brother, her voice clear and confident. That's exactly the situation we face in Centauri space. Military action by either side will result in damage to the very resources we're competing for. The mining facilities, the research stations, the colonial populations, all of these become worthless if they're destroyed in the fighting. Chen watched Vexai's expression change as he began to understand where the conversation was leading. The Draknari weren't being asked to accept human weakness. They were being shown a form of strength they had never considered. President Weber activated a holographic display showing the disputed territories in detail. Ambassador, the German Federation has significant investments in those systems. If your forces attack, we'll be forced to respond militarily. But look at what that means in practical terms. The display showed projected casualties, infrastructure damage, and economic losses for both sides. The numbers were staggering, representing years of development that would be destroyed in days of fighting. Now look at the alternative, Queen Sarah continued, manipulating the display to show a different scenario. Joint development of the disputed territories, human technological innovation combined with Draknari industrial capacity, shared profits instead of shared losses. Vexai stared at the projections for long minutes, his scarred features revealing nothing of his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note that Chen had never heard from a Draknari before: uncertainty. You propose cooperation between the hegemony and human colonies. King James nodded. We propose that true strength lies in creating wealth rather than seizing it, in building alliances rather than enforcing submission. The territories in question contain resources that could benefit both our species for generations. Military conquest would give the winner temporary control over damaged assets. Cooperative development would give both sides permanent access to growing prosperity. Chen realized that she was witnessing something unprecedented. A Draknari commander actually considering alternatives to military action. The rigid hierarchy and warrior culture of the hegemony had never before been exposed to human-style collaborative problem-solving. This is not how conflicts are resolved in hegemony space, Vexhai admitted slowly. No, Queen Sarah agreed, but it's how conflicts are prevented from becoming conflicts in the first place. Ambassador, your people respect strength. We ask you to consider whether the ability to turn enemies into allies might not be the greatest strength of all. The silence that followed stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, Vexhai activated his own communication device, speaking rapidly in the harsh syllables of the Draknari language. Chen's universal translator struggled with the military terminology and cultural references, but she caught enough to understand that he was ordering his fleet to maintain position while he continued his observations. Queen of Humans, Vexhai said at last, the hegemony will observe these cooperative development proposals, but we will also observe their implementation. If human words prove stronger than human weapons, the galaxy will indeed witness something new. Chen felt her knees go weak with relief, but she managed to maintain her diplomatic composure as the real negotiations began. For the first time in galactic history, a potential military conflict was being transformed into a cooperative venture through nothing more than human ability to imagine solutions that served everyone's interests. The negotiations that followed were unlike anything in the recorded history of galactic diplomacy. Instead of the usual pattern of threats, concessions, and carefully worded compromises designed to save face while accomplishing nothing, Ambassador Chen found herself watching three different species work together to solve a problem that benefited everyone involved. The main conference room of the Terran Royal Palace had been hastily reconfigured to accommodate the unique requirements of trilateral negotiations. Holographic displays showed real-time data from the Centauri system, while translation algorithms worked overtime to ensure that complex technical concepts could be communicated clearly between human standard, German Federation dialect, and the harsh military terminology of Draknari speech. President Weber leaned forward over the conference table, his expression intense as he studied the resource projections that Princess Elizabeth had helped compile. The Xenobiology Research Station alone represents 15 years of German Federation investment, but if we combine it with the Draknari mineral extraction techniques, we could potentially triple its research capacity while making it completely self-sustaining. Ambassador Vexhai's scarred features revealed nothing, but Chen had learned to read the subtle signs of Draknari interest. The way his clawed fingers drummed against the table's surface indicated deep thought, while the occasional flicker of his inner eyelids suggested that he was running complex calculations in his head. The hegemony's mining operations would benefit from human technological innovation, he admitted slowly, each word carefully chosen. Our methods are efficient but destructive. Human techniques preserve more of the extracted materials for useful purposes. Queen Sarah smiled, recognizing the significance of what Vexhai had just acknowledged. For a member of the Draknari military hierarchy, to admit that their methods could be improved was unprecedented. It suggested a level of intellectual flexibility that most galactic diplomats believed the warrior species simply didn't possess. King James activated a new set of projections showing the proposed joint colonies from multiple perspectives. The beauty of cooperative development is that it plays to each species' strengths while compensating for their weaknesses. German engineering excellence, human adaptability, and Draknari industrial capacity could create something that none of us could achieve alone. Prince Michael, who had been quietly working on detailed technical specifications, looked up from his calculations. Ambassador Vexhai, I've been studying Draknari metallurgy techniques. Your people can extract and process raw materials at efficiencies that are simply impossible with current human technology. But you tend to focus on quantity over diversity. Vexai's expression sharpened. Explain. Human colonies need approximately 47 different types of processed materials to maintain technological independence. Draknari operations typically focus on extracting large quantities of 5 or 6 primary resources. If we combined your extraction capacity with human materials science, we could create supply chains that serve both of our needs while reducing overall environmental impact. Chen watched the Draknari ambassador process this information, noting how his posture gradually shifted from defensive wariness to genuine interest. For a species that valued strength above all else, the possibility of achieving greater efficiency through cooperation represented a paradigm shift that challenged thousands of years of cultural assumptions. These calculations, Vexai said finally, they assume that humans and Draknari can work together without conflict. This assumption has no precedent in hegemony experience. Princess Elizabeth stood and walked to the central display, manipulating the projections with practiced ease. At 16, she had already demonstrated a talent for strategic thinking that impressed seasoned diplomats from a dozen different species. Ambassador, you're right that there's no precedent for extended cooperation between our species, but there's also no precedent for the kind of mutual benefit we're proposing. Look at these profit projections for both sides. The holographic display shifted to show economic models that stretched across decades rather than quarters or election cycles. The numbers were staggering. Joint development of the Centauri territories could generate wealth that dwarfed what either side could achieve through military conquest or independent development. More importantly, Princess Elizabeth continued, consider what this means for both of our species' long-term security. Cooperative ventures create stakeholders on both sides who have economic incentives to prevent conflicts. It's much harder to justify going to war with people who are helping to make you rich. President Weber nodded approvingly. The German Federation has learned this lesson through centuries of experience. Our most peaceful borders are those where we share economic interests with our neighbors. Trade creates stability in ways that military treaties never can. Vexai was silent for long minutes, his alien features unreadable as he studied the projections and considered implications that clearly challenged everything he had been taught about conflict resolution. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of uncertainty that Chen had never heard from a Draknari before. In hegemony space, strength is measured by the ability to take what you want from others. You propose measuring strength by the ability to create what others want to share. This is difficult for hegemony minds to process. Queen Sarah leaned forward, her expression sympathetic but firm. Ambassador, we're not asking you to abandon Draknari values. Strength is still strength, whether it's used to destroy or to build. We're simply suggesting that building might be a more efficient use of that strength. The conversation was interrupted by a soft chime indicating an incoming priority communication. Admiral Thompson's face appeared on the conference room's main screen, his expression grim enough to send ice through Chen's veins. Your Majesty, I apologize for the interruption, but we have a developing situation. Long-range sensors are detecting additional Draknari vessels entering Centauri space. Fleet composition suggests a full battle group rather than the exploration force that Ambassador Vexai arrived with. Vexai's entire body went rigid, his scarred features darkening with what Chen recognized as barely controlled rage. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of deadly calm that preceded violence among his species. Admiral Thompson, can your sensors identify the commanding vessel of this battle group? Affirmative. The flagship appears to be the hegemony dreadnought Conquering Blade, under the command of war leader Thexmer. Vexai's response was a single word in his own language, but Chen's universal translator helpfully provided the meaning, an extremely profane suggestion about Thexmer's ancestry that also implied serious questioning of his intelligence and battle experience. Ambassador, Queen Sarah said carefully, I take it this development wasn't authorized by your government. War leader Thexmer commands the hegemony's 5th battle group, Vexai explained through clenched teeth. He is politically ambitious and strategically impatient. If he has brought his fleet to Centauri space, it is because he believes that my diplomatic mission has shown weakness rather than strength. President Weber's expression hardened. How long before his fleet reaches the contested territories? Admiral Thompson consulted his displays. At current speed and heading approximately 8 hours, Your Majesty. Chen felt the careful progress of the last 2 days crashing down around her. All of their diplomatic innovations, all of the unprecedented cooperation between 3 different species, would be meaningless if a Draknari war leader decided that military action was preferable to patient negotiation. But as she watched the faces around the conference table, she realized that something fundamental had changed during their discussions. Instead of humans, Germans, and Draknari preparing to face each other as enemies, they were looking at the approaching crisis as a shared problem that required a collaborative solution. Ambassador Vexai, King James said quietly, what would happen if war leader Thexmer arrived in Centauri space and found Draknari, German, and human vessels working together instead of preparing for battle? Vexai's scarred features twisted into what might have been a smile among his species. War leader Thexmer would find himself in a very difficult position. He cannot attack cooperative ventures without risking censure from the hegemony high command, and he cannot claim glory from conquering territories that are already being developed peacefully by his own people. Princess Elizabeth was already moving toward the communications array. Then we need to make sure that's exactly what he finds. How quickly can we get development teams and initial infrastructure to Centauri space? President Weber was consulting his own displays, calculating travel times and resource allocation. The German Federation can have survey teams and initial habitat modules on site within 6 hours. Our fastest ships are already positioned in nearby systems. And human colonial vessels can provide technical support and diplomatic oversight, Queen Sarah added. Ambassador Vexai, would the hegemony be willing to contribute industrial equipment and security forces to protect the joint development sites? Chen watched in amazement as the 3 delegations began coordinating a massive logistical operation designed not to prevent a war, but to make war impossible by creating facts on the ground that even the most aggressive Draknari commander couldn't argue with. The next few hours would determine whether human diplomatic innovation could survive contact with Draknari military tradition. But for the first time since the crisis began, Chen found herself believing that they might actually pull off something unprecedented in galactic history, turning a potential military disaster into a cooperative triumph that would reshape how conflicts were resolved throughout Council space. 6 hours after the frantic planning session in the Terran Royal Palace, Ambassador Chen stood in the command center watching the most audacious diplomatic gamble in galactic history unfold in real time. Multiple holographic displays showed the Centauri system from dozens of different perspectives, tracking the movements of human, German, Draknari, and now additional Draknari vessels as they converged on space that had been disputed territory just hours ago. German Federation survey ship Bremen has established orbital position around Centauri 4, reported Captain Rodriguez, her voice steady despite the enormity of what they were attempting. Initial mining platform deployment is proceeding on schedule. Human colonial vessel New Horizons has linked up with the Draknari industrial ship Iron Forge, came another update. Joint construction crews are beginning work on the first cooperative habitat module. Queen Sarah stood beside Chen, watching the displays with an expression that mixed pride, terror, and fierce determination. The last 6 hours had transformed the Terran Royal Palace into the nerve center of an operation that spanned 3 different species and involved more cooperation between former enemies than had been achieved in centuries of galactic diplomacy. Draknari War leader Thexmer's battle group will reach sensor range in approximately 20 minutes, Admiral Thompson announced from his position at the Military Coordination Station. Ambassador Vexai, are you certain your people will follow your lead rather than his orders? Ambassador Vexai's scarred features remained impassive, but Chen had learned to read the subtle signs of tension in his posture. War leader Thexmer commands through fear and tradition. I command through opportunity and innovation. We will discover which approach the crews value more. Prince Michael looked up from the technical coordination station, where he had been tracking the joint development projects with the focused intensity of someone 3 times his age. The first cooperative mining operation is already showing efficiency improvements over projected baselines. If the crews can see the results of working together, that should carry more weight than abstract orders to fight. Princess Elizabeth was monitoring communications from the joint development sites, her expression growing more confident with each report. The German and Draknari engineering teams are working together better than anyone expected. There's something about solving technical problems that seems to cut through cultural barriers. King James activated the main communication array, preparing to address what might be the most diverse audience in diplomatic history. Human colonists, German Federation officials, Draknari workers, and a Draknari war leader whose arrival could either validate their diplomatic innovation or destroy everything they had built. This is King James of Earth, speaking to all vessels and personnel in Centauri space. What you have accomplished in the last 6 hours represents more than just rapid deployment of development assets. You have demonstrated that cooperation between different species and governments is not only possible, but more effective than competition or conflict. Through the communication system came responses from dozens of different sources. Progress reports from joint construction teams, efficiency data from cooperative mining operations, and most importantly, personal testimonials from crew members who had discovered that working with former enemies was not only possible, but surprisingly productive. War leader Thexmer's flagship is requesting communication with the Draknari vessels already in system, reported the communications officer. Chen felt her stomach clench as she realized that the moment of truth had arrived. Everything they had accomplished would be meaningless if the Draknari crews abandoned their cooperative projects in favor of military action ordered by a superior officer. Ambassador Vexhai stepped forward to the main communication station, his massive frame radiating the kind of quiet authority that came from absolute confidence in his position. When he spoke, his voice carried across multiple channels simultaneously, ensuring that every Draknari in the system could hear his words. War leader Thexmer, this is Ambassador Vexhai, speaking as representative of the Hegemony High Command and coordinator of joint development operations in Centauri space. Your arrival is unexpected. The response came back in the harsh syllables of formal Draknari military communication, but Chen's universal translator converted it to words that carried unmistakable menace. Ambassador Vexhai, you have exceeded your authority and compromised hegemony interests through unauthorized cooperation with inferior species. Withdraw all Draknari assets from joint operations immediately and prepare for proper military resolution of territorial disputes. The silence that followed stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Chen could feel the weight of history hanging in the balance as everyone in the system waited to see whether diplomacy or military tradition would prevail. Ambassador Vexhai's response was delivered in a tone that managed to be both respectful of military hierarchy and absolutely uncompromising in its rejection of Thexmer's authority. War leader Thexmer, the operations in Centauri space are proceeding under direct authorization from the Hegemony High Command, following successful diplomatic negotiations conducted according to traditional protocols. The joint development projects are generating resource extraction rates that exceed independent hegemony operations by margins of 30 to 50%. President Weber stepped forward to add his voice to the communication, his diplomatic experience evident in every carefully chosen word. War leader Thexmer, the German Federation welcomes the opportunity to demonstrate the practical benefits of cooperative development. Our joint operations are already producing results that exceed what any single government could achieve through independent action. But it was Princess Elizabeth who provided the crucial insight that transformed a potential military confrontation into an opportunity for face-saving diplomacy. War leader Thexmer, the hegemony vessels in this system have not shown weakness through cooperation. They have demonstrated superior strength by achieving greater efficiency and resource extraction than would be possible through conquest alone. The question is whether you command forces that are strong enough to participate in these enhanced operations. Chen held her breath as she realized what the 16-year-old princess had just done. Instead of challenging Thexmer's authority or questioning his military competence, she had reframed participation in the joint development as a test of Draknari's strength rather than a compromise of their values. The response from Thexmer's flagship took several minutes, during which Chen could imagine the war leader consulting with his staff and trying to find a way to save face while dealing with a situation that no amount of military training had prepared him for. Ambassador Vexhai, came the finally reply, the 5th Battle Group will observe these joint development operations to evaluate their effectiveness compared to traditional hegemony methods. If cooperative techniques prove superior to conquest, the High Command will require detailed reports for potential implementation in other disputed territories. Chen felt her knees go weak with relief as she realized that they had actually succeeded. Not only had they prevented a military confrontation, but they had created a precedent that could revolutionize how conflicts were resolved throughout Galactic Council space. Queen Sarah activated the palace-wide communication system, her voice carrying to every vessel in the Centauri system and to diplomatic observers throughout the galaxy. To all personnel participating in the Centauri development projects, you have accomplished something unprecedented in galactic history. You have proven that the strongest solutions are not those imposed by force, but those chosen freely by people working together toward common goals. Over the following hours, as reports continued to arrive from the joint development sites, Chen watched the transformation of what had begun as a territorial dispute into something approaching a galactic revolution in diplomatic methodology. Draknari efficiency experts were learning human adaptability techniques. German engineers were incorporating alien technologies into their designs. Human colonists were discovering that cooperation with former enemies could produce benefits that none of them had imagined possible. Ambassador Vexhai stood beside the main display, watching his people work alongside humans and Germans with an expression that mixed amazement with something that might have been pride. "Ambassador Chen," he said quietly, "when I arrived on Earth 3 days ago, I came to evaluate whether human diplomatic methods were worthy of respect or deserving of contempt. I have discovered that the question was incorrectly formulated." "How so?" Chen asked. "The question should not have been whether human methods work. The question should have been whether other species are strong enough to learn from human innovation." Vexhai's scarred features twisted into what was definitely a smile among his species. "The hegemony has much to learn about the application of strength through cooperation rather than domination." As the first joint development sites began operations that would serve as models for peaceful cooperation throughout the galaxy, Chen realized that the momentous state occasion that had brought President Weber to Earth had achieved something far greater than anyone had imagined possible. They had not just hosted a diplomatic visit. They had created new possibilities for resolving conflicts that could reshape the entire structure of galactic civilization. The royal family had proven that humanity's greatest strength lay not in its technology or its military capabilities, but in its ability to imagine solutions that served everyone's interests while compromising no one's dignity. And in doing so, they had established Earth as more than just another member of the Galactic Council. They had made humanity the species that other civilizations turned to when they needed to find ways to transform enemies into allies and conflicts into opportunities. The age of human diplomacy had begun, and the galaxy would never be the same.